I hope you can get a Bible and follow along with me. We'll be looking at chapter 4 tonight. St. James is the book that comes immediately after the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is easy to find in the New Testament because it's a big book, and St. James is a little one, but it's easy to find if you can locate Hebrews. So get a Bible and follow along with me as we read chapter 4 together. We'll be trying to get in a half an hour, we'll be trying to get through this whole chapter. So far we've seen in the Epistle of James that he is very, very practical. There's no theology, there's no philosophy, there's no kind of looking at who we are mystically and things like that. He is an extremely practical writer, gives us ideas, doesn't dwell on any one subject very long either, but touches on a subject, gives us practical advice, and then goes on to another subject. We are especially going to find this in these last chapters. You can't really even characterize the chapters, in my opinion. It's almost as if he has a certain number of things to say, and he says them, gives out his advice, and then closes the letter off. Well, let's read chapter 4 together. We're going to look, first of all, at these tough verses, chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Let's read that together. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasures that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Wow, these are tough verses. These are very tough verses. He's accusing people of being murderers and adulterers and adulteresses and so on. Well, I believe that he is, as I said before, I believe that the letter of St. James is written to Christians, is written to people who have already decided to give their lives to Jesus Christ, is written to people who are already a part of the church. And that doesn't change simply because he's written these verses at the beginning of chapter 4. Now, actually, we will run into some verses later on that I don't think are written to Christians that are even tougher than these verses are, but these verses are written to Christians. Now, I'm not sure that there are people in the church who are murderers, but I think he's saying murderers in the same way that Jesus says that, you know, when you slander somebody, you murder them. You are like a murderer. You're guilty of murder when you call somebody a fool. Now, I think that he's talking about it in that kind of a way, but still, we can learn some things about the early church because I think he is writing to members of his church in Jerusalem. I think we can learn some things about the early church from this. The first part is that there are battles that are going on. Where do wars and fights come from among you? The word wars in theirs can also be translated as battles. Where do battles and fights come from among you? Well, without answering that question, we can look at the fact that battles and fights are a part of the early church. And as a matter of fact, battles and fights are a part of every church. And it should not, and it is not any different than that. I was speaking with a woman this week one time who was saying to me that, it was a man who was saying to me that there were certain people in my own parish were acting in a particular way, and he said that Christians should not act that way, that they think they're Christians, they go to church all the time, and yet they act that way. That shouldn't be that way. That's wrong. And he said that, you know, of course, that he didn't want to become part of, or he didn't want to be part of a church where people were acting that way. Well, I didn't say anything to him at the time. As a matter of fact, I think that what I'm going to do is go back to him again and again and again, and until finally he kind of talks out his bitterness. So I didn't say anything to him then, but in my mind I was thinking to myself, what would you expect? Why would perfect people go to church? Perfect people can stay home. It's the ones who need. It's like our old series that we did on Tradition Today some time ago called The Church's Spiritual Hospital, when I was talking about the teaching of Herotheos Vlachos. The Church's Spiritual Hospital, we talked about how it was that when you need healing, you go to the church. When you need spiritual comfort, you go to the church. When you need forgiveness, you go to the church. If you don't need forgiveness, you don't need to go to the church. Why would a completely healthy person go to the hospital? So you can watch the drama in the emergency room or read some 3-month-old magazines that they have on the table there? You don't go there. You only go there if you need something, if you need to be healed. And indeed, the church is the place where people go to be healed of these things and to be forgiven of their sins. So, is there a church that has nobody in it that causes trouble? Is there a church that has nobody in it who is sinful? No, there are no such churches. One time a good friend of mine, he was a pastor, he's a priest, he was a pastor of a church that was a bad church. They were tough people. They were tough with each other and they were tough with the priests. And they weren't very nice, and they were terrible people. And he said to me at one point, we were talking, and he said, I wish I could be assigned to a church that didn't have any problems. And I said to him, well, actually, there is a church near me that doesn't have any problems. And I was referring to a church down the street from my church. It was a big brick church, very large, bigger than my church. And it had been painted white, and it had been abandoned for many, many years. It was empty. There were birds living in it and drug deals going on and things like this. Now it's been knocked down by the city, and some other building has been put up there. But so I said to him, there's a church near me with no problems. And he said, oh, there is? And I said, yeah, it's abandoned. It has no people. If you want to find a church that has no problems, you need to find a church that has no people. Because where there are people, there are going to be problems. Not because that's not the way it should be, but because we are all sinners and we need forgiveness and we need to come to the church for healing. Now, of course, that doesn't make these things right. When there's strife going on in my own parish, I like to address it. I like to try to see if people can reconcile themselves one with another. It doesn't make church strife right, but we can see it right here. First century church in Jerusalem. The Bishop James writing to the people and saying, why are you constantly arguing with one another? And so on. In a way, it sort of gives us some comfort. This church also, these verses also rather, deal with the subject of prayer. With what is the one thing that makes people leave God? As I have tried to go to talk to people who have gone away from the church, if you push hard enough, it seems to me that 9 times out of 10, perhaps more than that, people leave the church because of unanswered prayer. This is what he says. You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight in war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. St. James is saying to his people, you want to have your prayers answered, and yet you're praying for ridiculous things. You're praying for things that are against the will of God. Whenever I read this verse, I always think of the thing that happens to me occasionally when people come up and ask me to bless lottery tickets. bless lottery tickets. You know, when they come up sometimes they say, Father, would you bless this lottery ticket? It hasn't happened to me in the last few years because I think people know now that I'm not going to do it. But they come, will you bless a lottery ticket? No, I'm not going to bless a lottery ticket unless you say that you're going to give 100% of what you win to the poor and to the church and to the relief of the poor. And the people say, oh, no, no, no. You know, if I win, I'm going to give a lot of money away, but I'm not going to give it all away because I really want that yacht and I really want the H2 so I can drive around and everybody can admire me. No, in that case, then God is not going to bless you to win the lottery. In fact, I don't think he is, even if you promise to give 100%. You ask amiss. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss. Sometimes I've found that people will turn their backs on God because of unanswered prayer. I know this happened to me in my own life. It was when I was very little. My brother got a new set of golf clubs, and he gave me his old set. It was an old, round leather bag. It was all beat up and dirty and things, and in it he had maybe 4 or 5 golf clubs. And he got a new one, a big thing, you know, and it was real nice and everything, and he gave me the old one. Now, I never played golf. In fact, I've never played golf in my life. But what I like to do occasionally was go putting, you know, go putt-putt with my friends. You know, I was very young, maybe 8 years old. And we would go to putt-putt sometimes, or miniature golf, and we would play. And I thought, you know, if I have my own putter, boy, I'm going to be really something. I'm going to go there and I'm going to say, yeah, the putters they have here, you know, they're okay, but I have my own putter because it's, you know, it's my private stock putter here, and take it out and maybe make a little case for it or something. Well, it turned out my brother bought a new set of golf clubs and a new bag, but he didn't buy a new putter. So he gave me the old set, but he took the putter with him. So here I had this set of golf clubs, which I didn't really want, with no putter, which was the one thing I did want. So I put it over in the corner of my room, and I went to bed, and I was thinking about how to get a putter, and then it occurred to me, well, I can ask God. That's easy, right? So I prayed. I said, Lord, tomorrow when I wake up, I want you to put a putter in the golf bag over, it's in the corner of my room, I'm sure you can see it, and thanks a lot, and good night. And I went to sleep. And I'll never forget the feeling that I had the next morning when I woke up. I was so excited. It was like Christmas morning, only more so. And I jumped out of bed and I was like, yes, here I am. I'm going to have my own putter. It's going to be so cool. And I ran over and I looked in the golf bag and I didn't know what to think. It wasn't there. I said, you know, gee, I told him to put it here. You know, why would he put it somewhere else? And maybe he wants me to look for it. So I looked around my room, and I looked around my room, and I looked around my room, and I couldn't find a putter. And so I thought, oh, this is weird. Now, why isn't this working? I go to, you go to church, people are praying for things all the time. A lot of times they say they get them. Well, here I am, right? So I went out, and my mom was out in the kitchen, and she was doing something, and I went over to her, and I said, do you have a putter, my putter? And she said, what? What putter? What are you talking about? And it occurred to me in that moment. I went, oh, I'm not going to get, this isn't going to happen. And I went, oh, forget it. And I went back in my room and I thought, that's it. This obviously doesn't work. People are telling you that it works, but it doesn't work. Now, okay, we could say, all right, you're an 8-year-old kid, you're praying for a golf putter, you didn't get the golf putter, big deal. But you know what I found? As I've gotten older, I found that more and more people do this kind of thing. I was trying to think of an example from a long time ago. This happened a long time ago and in a totally different place. But a woman came to me she was at wit's end. She was very upset. And she was upset. She was a brand new mother. And the baby cried at night. And she was exhausted. Her husband worked full-time. She did not work. She had quit her job in order to take care of the baby. So the husband was sleeping. In fact, I think sometimes he even slept down in the basement to be away from all the commotion at night because he needed to get a good night's sleep. So she's up in the bed and she's sleeping and the baby cries and she's having to get up and take care of the baby. And I think that she was completely exhausted and the baby would start crying and she would say, Lord, make the baby stop crying. Could you get it this time, God? I'm tired. And the baby didn't stop crying. And so she would get up and she would take care of the baby. And then she comes to the priest and she says, what gives? I'm praying, but I'm not getting what I'm praying for. I felt a little bit like an insurance executive or insurance salesman who, this person has been paying and paying and paying all these years. I mean, she said, I come to church, I pay the tithe, I take communion, I go to confession, I've been paying in, I'm not getting the return on my investment. And she was saying, I'm praying, and the baby still continues to cry. You see, so these things don't stop when we're young. These things don't stop. That sometimes they follow us throughout our life, that we think in immature ways. And this is what St. James is saying. You ask for things and you don't receive them because it's against the will of God. You know that you're asking for things that God doesn't want you to have. Incidentally, I said to this woman, there are babies that don't cry. But you know what? You don't want your baby to be one of them. Let's go on here. We're going to read verse 5 through 10. Chapter 4, book of James, verses 5 through 10. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. You have inner churning. Your soul and your body are not peaceful. Why is it? Why is this happening? Because God is after you. God longs for you and he will not leave you alone. That's the meaning of verse 5. Seems like it's a little out of place. Do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in you yearns jealously? What's he saying there? He's saying that you have inner turmoil, you have questions, you have no peace in your soul. And why is it? Because you turn your back on God, but he won't let you go. You turn your back on him and he pursues you and he draws you back. This is why he says in verse 6, but he gives more grace. You know what happens when you turn your back on God? He doesn't turn his back on you. He continues to come after you to make your soul unsettled until you turn back to him. And you do turn back to him. And then you turn away from him and he comes after you again. St. James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Do you see that kind of movement that takes place? God is coming to you, you are coming to him, and the two of you come together. When you turn away from God, he still comes after you. He is after you like the hound of heaven. Now, compare verse 5 to verse 9. Do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? God is after you. Listen to what he says in verse 9. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. This is what we call the gift of tears. This is what we call joy-producing sorrow. You know, sometimes people come to confession, and I'm always glad when people come to confession, but sometimes people come to confession and they don't have anything to confess. They come because they like to come. They come once a year or something like that, and they come and they say, I want to come to confession. And so I pray the prayers at the beginning of confession, and then I say to them, do you have anything to say? And they say, no, I don't have anything to say. I'll say, you don't have anything to say? No, Father, nothing big. Oh, I say, are you perfect? And they say, oh, no, I'm not perfect. I mean, nobody answers that question. Well, yes, I am. But that's what they're saying. When they come to confession, they don't have any sins. That's what they're saying, is that they're perfect. So I say, do you think you're perfect? They all say, no, I'm not perfect. And I say to them, in what way are you not perfect? What is it that makes you not perfect? And 9 times out of 10, in fact, more than that, the person will say to me, I don't really know. God knows. God knows what my sins are. You see, and that makes me so sad. It makes me sad not because I want to hear people tell me their sins. I don't want to hear people tell me their sins. But it makes me sad because it means they have no sensitivity to sin. They have no idea when they're sinning and when they're not sinning. A person like that can live through an entire day and come to the end of the day, and you say to them, in what ways did you sin today? And that person would say, I don't think I sinned at all today. You see? They have no sensitivity to sin at all. This is what St. James is talking about in this passage. Lament, mourn, weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. He's not saying, I want you to be an unhappy person. He's saying to you, I want you to have some sensitivity for your sin. Well, now, as I was reading that, I was thinking of one of the books that I love to read during the Lenten season called The Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. St. John was the abbot of the monastery on Sinai for many, many years. And he wrote this book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is essentially like a series of steps that brings you closer to God. And one of his steps, I remembered as I was reading this passage from St. James, one of his steps is called On Joy Making Sorrow. This is just one part of it. Greater than baptism itself is the fountain of tears after baptism, even though it is somewhat audacious to say so. What's St. John saying? He's saying, you're baptized and you're saved, but afterwards, when you sin and you cry and you weep because of your sin, that's like a second baptism. That's a second anointing, a second cleansing with water. Now he says the second is almost better than the first. He's not making a theological statement. He's not trying to introduce a new canon to the laws of the church. He's making a poetic statement, not a canonical statement. And that's why he says, even though it is somewhat audacious to say so, for baptism is the washing away of evils that were in us before, but sins committed after baptism are washed away by tears. As baptism is received in infancy, we have all defiled it, but we cleanse it anew with tears. Now, whether he's talking to you who are baptized as an infant or you were baptized as an adult, still at some point in the past you were baptized. And since that time you have sinned. And what St. James is calling us to, what St. John Climacus is calling us to, is that we should be sensitive to those sins. We should realize the extent to which they draw us and pull us away from God. If God, in his love for mankind, had not given us those tears, those being saved would be very few indeed and hard to find. Okay, we're going to read verse 11 through 13. St. James chapter 4. Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law, judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? Come now, you who say, I don't want to go on and read that part. So how is it, St. James says that if you judge another person, you are actually a judge of the law. How does he say that? I mean, is it so bad to be a judge of another person? He's kind of drawing you into this divine struggle, right? That if you judge another person, you're actually standing in judgment over God, over God's law. What does he mean by that? Well, if you judge another person, he says you need to remember that you also break the law, that you also do bad things. But when you judge another person, when you stand in judgment over them, you're saying that the thing that they do is worse than the thing you do. That the law says that what they do is really bad, but what you do isn't that bad. That's the way that you stand in judgment over the law. You're saying that the law has certain levels and that that person is breaking one of the big ones and you're breaking one of the little ones here. St. James wants to say to you, no, what you need to realize is that you're breaking the law. And even if that person is breaking a big law and you're breaking a little law, you're still breaking a little law. And you still need to be sensitive to that and confess that and weep for that. Turn your joy into mourning, he says. Not mourning like the time of the day, but mourning sadness. Turn your joy into sadness. Weep for the sins you have committed. All right. Boy, I see I'm real close to the end here. I want to read verses 14 through 17 very quickly. Come now, you who say, I'm actually verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. St. James begins that part of his letter with the words, come now. This is something my father used to say to me sometimes. Come now. What does it mean? Be reasonable. What, are you joking? You know, come on, be real. That's what that kind of thing means. And that's what St. James is saying. Come now. You think that the good things in your life are the result of your hard work and effort? The good things that you have in your life are a blessing to you given by God. And you need to realize that and recognize that by making it a part of your speech. The part of your speech that says, when you plan to do something, if God wills, that's what I will do. Now notice, he doesn't have anything about using that hypocritically. He says, no, you just go ahead and say that. If you plan to do something, say, if the Lord wills, that's what will happen. Well, we've come again to the end of our session. I hate to go so fast through these chapters, but as we part our ways, we seek the intercessions of St. James, the brother of our Lord, for us, that he would keep us safe and healthy until next time we gather together on Tradition Today to study the Holy Scriptures. And now, God bless you.